Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Michael Connolly, to discuss Jacobitism's rise in Britain and the United States in the Victorian era. Dr. Connolly is a professor of history here at PNW. He got his master's and Ph.D. in American history at the Catholic University of America. His teaching and research addresses the politics and political economy of 19th century America. He has published widely on U.S. history. He just released a book, Jacobitism in Britain and the United States, 1880-1910, that details the resurgence of the Jacobite movement that emerged in Britain and the United States at the time. He explains in the book the rise and fall of Anglo-American Jacobitism and places it in its historical context and reveals its significance for the politics of that era. Understanding the Jacobite movement clarifies Anglo-American anxiety over liberalism, democracy, industry, and I would say even the popular response. I think we probably should begin with, what is a Jacobite?
Well, it's not a word that many people probably know in their regular vocabulary. A lot of people will get Jacobite confused with Jacobin.
Yes, the French Revolution.
Yeah, so and they're completely different. A Jacobin is a French revolutionary, right? As I say in the book, someone who has a volume of Rousseau in one hand and a cord to the guillotine in the other. Jacobites are quite different. Jacobites are supporters of the Stuart monarchy and hope to bring back the Stuart monarchy to the throne in Great Britain. In 1688, during something called the Glorious Revolution, of course the Jacobites would never call it glorious,
right,
the Stuarts, particularly James II, was kicked off the throne of Britain. And Jacobites, over the 18th century, are trying to put the Stuarts back on the throne. Now, obviously, James II will die, so they try to get his son on the throne, and then, of course, his grandson, famously Bonnie Prince Charlie, in the Great Uprising of 1745, but they fail. And Jacobitism goes away.
Where does the word
Jacobite is Latin for James.
Okay.
So Jacobus is Latin for James. So a follower of James, in this case meaning James II, is a Jacobite. So even across the years, when the heir, the Stuart heir, is not in fact a James, the name retains all the way through, right down to this very day.
So you talked about 1688. That's a long time from 1688 to 18. We're talking 200 years before there's this resurgence of Jacobitism. So why does this happen in the Victorian era, that late 19th century period in both Britain and the U.S.?
Right. So in the 18th century, after violent uprisings on the part of Jacobites, 1715, the big one in 1745, after they fail, Jacobitism sort of fades away. It becomes the stuff of Walter Scott novels, right? Very romantic.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, in the 1880s, an organization called the Order of the White Rose is founded in Great Britain, and it is a Jacobite organization. All of a sudden, in the 1880s, in particular the 1890s, right up through World War I, there is a discernible Jacobite movement that pops up in Great Britain. Now, it is different than the Jacobite movement that you saw in the 18th century, which was pretty much solely interested in restoring the Stuarts to the throne. In late Victorian Britain, and eventually the United States, the Jacobite movement pops up not only because it really does want to put a Stuart on the throne, they're not completely happy with Victoria, but there's all kinds of other things going on. This is the late 19th century, late Victorian England.
Industrial Revolution.
There is industrial ferment. The cities are crime-ridden and dirty and overcrowded. Working conditions are terrible in factories. Workers seem to be abused in this industrial system. There's the rise of trade unionism and strikes and political violence as well. And these Jacobites use this new resurgent Jacobite movement as a way to speak to, in particular, those issues, not just to put another Stuart on the throne.
So they're speaking against trade unionism, socialism, anarchism, anything that seems to smack of progressive social movements.
Most isms of the day,
the isms,
the Jacobites will be opposed to. But, and here's the great the asterisk to what the Jacobites are about. These are not free market capitalists who are cheering on the Industrial Revolution. Quite the opposite, they condemn it. And the Jacobite movement is actually in defense of what they see as the health of workers, the safety of workers, protect the countryside. They're very much critical of the Industrial Revolution, the new financial system, and the like.
Are these aristocrats? I mean, do they have some connection to the past levels of monarchy and the people that own the land, and they're trying to restore, kind of make Britain great again?
Make it great again. They didn't use that phrase, but maybe they could have. The British Jacobite movement has three major groups that join it. One are aristocrats, certainly, titled aristocrats. The second are clerics, in particular. Most of them are Anglican, but there's a pretty good size Roman Catholic contingent as well. And then finally, this is a clunky way to put it, but the creative class, artists, poets, sculptors, writers, who very much romantics, who are looking at this resurgent Jacobite movement as a way to criticize the day, because they feel that the times are rotten in late Victorian Britain, and they are going to criticize it and try to right it.
So in Britain, I would think that there may be some response to this movement from the Scottish nationalists and the Irish nationalists. Would that be accurate? Because they never liked the expansion of England and they associate it with the current crown?
Yes, so within those three groupings, not as a separate group to themselves, sort of sprinkled amongst those three groups are certainly Scottish nationalists. Theodore Napier is the famous one, with his kilt and his targe, and he's up there defending the independence, hoping the independence of Scotland, but also Irish nationalists as well. In fact, that one of the co-founder of the Order of the White Rose, Lord Ashburnham, was the president of the Irish Home Rule Association in Britain. So there's Irish, Scottish, Cornish nationalism as well. The other co-founder of the order is a Cornish nationalist and language expert. So you're right, ethnic nationalism is sprinkled throughout all of these three groups.
This may be an aside, but we're talking about Victorian England. And I think of Victoria riding around in a horse-drawn carriage and having tea. Could you kind of give us a feel for what the culture was like in Victorian England?
So this is the height of the Jacobite movement is the 1890s, right? The mauve decade, or the gay 90s. This is the decadent 1890s, the end of the 19th century and the end of Victoria's reign. She'll die in January of 1901, and that sort of hangs over everything. Everybody is very aware that Queen Victoria,
she's about done.
She's old and she's going to die soon. Her big jubilee comes up in, I forget what year, 1897. There's this palpable sense that something is coming to an end. Mm-hmm. And so the 1890s have this tinge of decadence that comes with them. And it sort of plays into what I said earlier about all the industrial problems and things like that. There's a sort of a cultural decadence that's at play too in this, on both sides of the Atlantic.
I wonder what role the fact that the working class, as you said, perceives itself to be disabused and not having equal opportunities and certainly not getting a wage. So there's a lot of resistance that may be experienced through strikes and protests and the rest.
Right.
Does this contribute to the appeal of Jacobitism? Because as if, if the Stuarts were here, this kind of thing wouldn't happen because they would be friendlier to the mass.
But Jacobites will say the great detour in history, and of course it was a detour down the wrong way, was 1688. If the Stuarts had not been ejected from the throne, none of the troubles that we have today would have happened. It's a direct result of 1688. And they picture the 1688 revolution as a revolution of merchants and the commercial life that put Britain down this industrial commercial road. Now, it's important to remember that the Jacobite movement was not a popular movement. There are not 10,000 Jacobites in the streets chanting for the end of Victoria. This is an elite.
They met in the elite clubs.
This is an elite movement, which it still has tremendous importance because even mass movements are led by elites and hierarchies. So this is important despite the fact, at its height, it's probably a couple thousand. That's both sides.
But they're well placed, I would think.
Very well placed in major institutions in Britain and the United States. Yeah.
So one of the things in the book you suggest, even though it seemed like you veered from this just a second ago, that Jacobitism was a reform movement.
Yeah.
But it's, I mean, granted, it's not a social movement with thousands of people, but they're attempting to reform what exactly? What is the reform that they're looking for? If it's not to replace a Stuart on the throne, what would they like to, what did they advocate?
You're right. So they want a Stuart on the throne.
Oh, well, yes.
They
I
do.
get that.
But there's all those other things along
Yeah.
with it. By the way, the real, they would say, the de jure monarch of Britain is Mary of Bavaria, who, if you trace down through Jacobite lineage who the real Queen of England should be, it is in fact Mary of Bavaria, not Queen Victoria, who is, a de facto queen. What do they want to do? These Jacobites are a reform movement, and they're attacking this industrial system. They don't get into specific policy proposals. They're not legislators or anything like that, but they want to see in particular an empowered crown and take some authority away from Parliament, because they see Parliament as a bunch of oligarchs or in the control of oligarchs. They believe that a solution to some of the problems of the late 19th, early 20th century would come with a king or queen who's not just a figurehead, but someone who has real veto power and
Divine right.
some would go as far as to say divine right, but most of them aren't making an absolutist case. They just want to see the crown get more into the power of the system than it is currently. The Parliament's too powerful.
So this, I mean, it makes historic sense the way that you've just explained it. What I have trouble with is understanding why would a Jacobite movement appear in the United States that had revolted against the crown. And
Right.
I mean, who here would be attracted to that? Who were its leaders? What did they expect to happen in the U.S.?
Right, so everything I've said, you said, how is that possible? How could that possibly relate to the United States? So it does come across to the United States. In fact, by the middle of the 1890s, I think 1896,
Need to stop the immigrants. I mean, there's a good argument. Never mind.
well, no, not quite. There is an active Jacobite movement in the United States by the middle of the 1890s. Now, it comes over, and who does it appeal to? It appeals to two of those three previous groups, United States Episcopalian and Catholic clerics, as well as artists, writers. And the two great leaders of Jacobitism in the United States are an architect by the name of Ralph Adams Cram. I don't know if you've ever heard of him before. He's
Only from the book, yeah.
One of the most prominent architects in the United States up through about World War II. He was best known for the neo-Gothic movement in the United States. You see his buildings in Chicago, virtually any city in the country. It's the sort of castellated look of churches.
Which visually fits with Jacobite, yeah.
Perfect, right?
Yeah.
So it's Ralph Adams Cram, who's also a writer. He writes mystery stories, horror stories. He's a fascinating fellow. And an Anglican, Canadian priest, actually, who comes down to the United States named Robert Thomas Nicol. And the two of them found these organizations and grow this Jacobite movement in the United States. But you're right, how does this fit in the United States? There's no queen, no king or queen. Do they want a king or a queen? It's a hard argument to make in the 1890s. What Cram is suggesting is that, now think about how this parallels, the president should be more powerful. Congress is dominated by industrial oligarchs. We need to have a much more powerful presidency. And who is Ralph Adams Cram's hero of the Founding Fathers? Perhaps you can guess. An empowered presidency? Alexander Hamilton. He looks to Alexander Hamilton for inspiration and says, how come we can't build upon Hamilton's insights and empower 1890s, who Grover Cleveland and William McKinley or something like that, a much more powerful presidency paralleling the rise and power of the throne in England to solve all the problems I've mentioned.
So centralized authority is the theme that goes across the ocean.
If I were to put on my Jacobite hat, the Jacobites would say, growing democracy across the 19th century has not proven itself able to protect the rights of workers or improve the conditions of the cities. In fact, on democracy's watch, everything has gotten worse.
Yeah. It sounds a little bit like a theorist in communication, Laswell, that said that within a mass society, you need to be able to manipulate public opinion, because the public's not smart enough to make its own decisions. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting they're saying this, but there needs to be an elite, a leader that's capable of deciding what's best and what's in everybody's best interest.
Right.
So.
You should have talked to me beforehand. I could have put that theory in a footnote or something like that.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about the political aspect of this, the authoritarian king or authoritarian, and you've several times talked about this, the one component which included the clerics from both Catholic and evangelical, and I understood they were at odds with each other back in 1688. So what's the religious dimension of this? Because that has to be a powerful attractor.
Some would argue even the most powerful factor in some of this. It does have Jacobitism has a religious aspect in that it appeals to certain churches or denominations more than it does others. It is extremely appealing to high church Anglicans, those who are very liturgical in their emphasis, as opposed to low church evangelicals. It also has an appeal to Roman Catholics, and one of the odd things, I shouldn't say odd, it's one of the noticeable things in the story of the Jacobites is, as time goes on, many of them actually convert to the Roman Catholic Church. Both the founders, British founders of the Order of the White Rose, Lord Ashburnham and Henry Jenner, who's this Cornish nationalist I was talking about, both convert to Roman Catholicism. The two Americans, Father Nickel, who is an Episcopalian priest, converts to Catholicism, wants to become a Catholic priest, but the Catholic Church doesn't want him. Ralph Adams Cram starts out as a Unitarian and converts. He goes to Rome, goes to midnight mass at Rome, and you would think this is going to do it. He converts to become a high Anglican, can't make the last step, does not become a Roman Catholic. But he goes to Rome to become a high Anglican. So yes, there is a very much a religious underpinning, a religious foundation to everything that you see in this rise of Jacobitism in the 19th century.
It seems to be like a cohesive, symbolically cohesive unit, because you've got the architecture, you've got the religious, you've got the political. It
fits.
It all kind of works together.
They're pieces of the puzzle. And remember, the High Anglicans and the Roman Catholic Church are very anti-modern, particularly the Roman Catholic Church in this era. This is the era where Catholic popes are issuing anti-modern encyclicals, which are very much critiquing everything that I've already spoken of, extremely appealing to Jacobites.
So you're a historian, Dr.
True.
Connolly.
Yes.
But why this? I mean, of all the things that you could have looked at, why did you feel compelled to write on Jacobit? Because it was something that hadn't been addressed? I mean, what was your motivation here?
Yes, there is that. It came upon me by just sort of luck and curiosity. I was flipping through a 2-volume history of New England literature and culture by Van Wyck Brooks, which was written in the 1930s, because that's what historians do. And in the second volume, which talks about later part of the 19th century, there was this chapter called the Epigony, which means like the offspring. And it was talking about how the Emersonian generation is dying and this new generation is coming up. And it has a paragraph in there saying, and then there were these monarchical Bostonians who were Jacobites, and one of them was Ralph Adams Cram. And I had never heard of this before. Yeah. So I went and researched it, and that's what it ended up with.
Wow.
Curiosity.
Well, I guess that's why many other questions, even contemporary questions, lead people back to how did we get to this particular position from where we came from? And there's pieces of history that we don't know about. I mean, people don't know about the Amistad Rebellion.
All that
they don't know fully about the Haitian Revolution.
Right.
And so this kind of falls in a different way, but it falls in that same vacuum of what we, right?
Yeah.
We don't know what we don't know, so to speak.
There was mention of it. Like no one ever heard of it before, but there was fleeting mention here and there, and I wanted to know the whole story. So I went and spent a couple of years researching it to try to pull everything together.
That's my question.
Into one.
How did you do this? I mean, an interesting part I would think would be here. Well, how do historians get to something like this is the results? So did you like travel to England and talk with the Stuart family? And I mean, how did you do the research that ended up in this?
It was a lot of tracking stuff down. you start with personalities. You say, okay, we know who the big leaders are. Let me find out some more about these people, and then you have dates, and you spread out from there. I was able to track down some manuscript collections. For example, Father Nicol was a Canadian. I know that he taught at Trinity School, which is a very well-known Canadian private school in Ontario. I asked them, do you have any records on Nicol? And they did. And I contacted the Boston Athenaeum. I said, do you have any records on the Order of the White Rose? And they said, we do. And so I was able to pull together from various depositories some manuscript collections and a lot of newspaper work and secondary work. And it came together as a coherent story.
You mentioned this, I almost asked you earlier, but what the heck is the White Rose all about?
Yes.
I mean, it's on the cover of the book, but...
Yeah, I almost wore it. I should have. I ran out of the house too fast. I have a little lapel white
Then I would have
rose.
asked you immediately.
You would have started off the conversation with that. It's something of a mystery as to why that's the case, but the White Rose is the symbol of the Jacobites. It may have come from the War of the Roses. I think it's the Lancastrians have a white rose. The Virgin Mary is symbolized by a white rose, but it has come down through time as a symbol of the Jacobite movement. And it was very cleverly sort of put into designs of things. So it was like when Jacobitism was illegal or unpopular.
So it was identified with the Stuarts? Is that
Absolutely.
I mean, and they just kind of appropriated it?
And the Jacobites adopted it, and that's why I have the Order of the White Rose. It's come down to us from that day to this, that it's a symbol of the Jacobites.
Oh, great. We're talking 1910, 1920, it kind of disappears. Are there any remnants of Jacobitism in either Britain or the U.S.? I mean, I think immediately when we start talking about Queen Victoria, I think of Queen Elizabeth and all of the prayers, the pomp and circumstance of her funeral, and people are, mourning the loss of their monarch, even in the U.S., which strikes me as a little bit bizarre.
Americans are great monarchists.
Yes. So, is there any remnant of this today?
By the way, you could probably guess why the Jacobitism faded because of World War I. The heirs to the Jacobite succession are Germans. They're Bavarians.
Well, you said Bavarian before, yeah.
Yeah, so when World War I comes along, it becomes a little inconvenient to be a Jacobite.
Yeah.
Are there remnants today? Sure, there are. There are organizations. The Society of King Charles the Martyr, which is still around both sides of the Atlantic, is in existence, and the Royal Stuart Society, which considers itself the heir to the Jacobite movement of the 1890s, is still around today as well. So Jacobitism is alive and well.
We don't have a lot of time left. This conversation goes quickly, but I want to ask you another question.
Yep.
A final one? It may be surprising, but what significance does Victorian Jacobitism have, or what lessons could be drawn for the United States today? I know there's a push towards authoritarianism from some quarters, but is there anything that you might summarize? What lessons can we learn from this for 2023 in the United States? I
had one big idea in mind when I was writing it, and that was to attack the idea, or critique, attack's a little strong, critique the idea that the United States is monolithically a liberal nation, that we have left liberals who err towards the state and right liberals who err towards the market, and there's really no other tradition in the country. The Jacobites, I think, show that there, in fact, is for lack of a better way of putting it, an anti-liberal strain in the United States. It pops up here and there. I'm more interested in the New England strain of it, and this is very definitely a northeastern strain. But American political culture is more complex than just this monolithic left-right liberalism. There are anti-liberalisms of the left and anti-liberalisms of the right percolating underneath, and with the book I was trying to bring to light at least one of these exceptions to what people call the liberal consensus.
We don't have much time left today. I just would like to encourage you to come back, and so we could talk about the railroad history of New England. I would love to see the writing on that and to have a conversation on that. And given the importance of rail in the U.S. today, and it would be a wonderful conversation.
I'll bring maps. I'll bring everything you need.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Dr. Connolly, for joining us. That's all the time we have. I want to thank you again for joining me on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.